Hello everyone. Today we will be talking about the last section of Chapter 13 in Social Psychology. And the second half of the chapter on social psychology discusses social influence and how this influences our behavior and cognitions. And so the definition of social influence is the ability to control another's behavior. So if you want someone to give you their time, money, allegiance, or affection, you may be wise to consider what is it that they want first. And in order to influence another individual, you must understand the three basic motivations which make someone more susceptible to influence. And these include the hedonic, the approval, and the accuracy motives. The hedonic motive is where people are motivated to experience pleasure and to avoid experiencing pain. The approval motive is where people are motivated to be accepted and to avoid being rejected. And lastly, the accuracy motive is where people are motivated to believe what is right and to avoid believing what is wrong. And we'll talk more in depth about each one of these in the next few slides. So with a hedonic motive, our most basic motivation is to seek pleasure. And so we could see this in any situation where we go out of our way to seek pleasure or just in order to avoid pain. So a couple of examples that we have of this hedonic motive include its influence on our behavior. And so one example of this is when Singapore warned its citizens that anyone caught chewing gum in public would face a year and a $5,500 fine. And so the rest of the world seemed to be either outraged or amused at this new law. But when all the criticism and chuckling subsided, what we see when looking at the data is that the number of felonies involving gum chewing in Singapore had fallen to an all-time low. Another example with the hedonic motive is where rewards and punishment can influence our behavior, but they can also backfire. And so one example of this is a study involving children who were allowed to play with colored markers and then were given a good player award. When the children were given markers the next day, those who had received an award were less likely to play with them than those who had not received an award. So why is this? Because children who had received an award the first day, it was believed that they came to think of drawing as something one did to receive rewards. And if no one was going to give them an award or reward, then why should they do it? So with these two examples, we can see that we'll go out of our way to avoid pain, and sometimes this behavior may not always be adaptive. So with the approval motive I think is very interesting. So we as humans are very motivated to be accepted and to avoid being rejected. So whether we're accepted or not is shaped by social norms or standards of behavior in society. And since we like being accepted, we'll follow those norms, like what clothes we wear or what brands of clothes that we buy from the store. So similarly, normative influence is where we look to others to decide how to behave in any given situation. So for example, what happens when you're in an elevator full of strangers? Do you automatically get on your phone, get quiet, stop talking to your friend? Do you act like you're texting on your phone, check your profile? How do we actually come to learn this type of behavior of just getting in the elevator and being in an elevator with a lot of strangers? So notice that what people do when you get into an elevator the next time. And what we see is that we adjust our behavior to how other people are behaving around us. And thus others have this type of normative influence over us. So norms aren't usually explicitly taught. They are more like unwritten rules. And we learn them quickly and obey them most of the time. The last approval motive that we see within the chapter is the norm of reciprocity. And this is where we feel as though we have to return a favor to someone. And so examples of this would include Christmas cards and lunch. And so if you send a bunch of Christmas cards, then you would probably receive a bunch back from other people that you had sent those out to. And another example of this would be your friend picking up the tab for lunch and then you paying for dinner later. So there's this reciprocity between you and another individual where it's an almost unwritten social rule that you return a favor. And so another example of this approval motive is the door in the face technique. And this is used as a marketing tactic all the time, actually. So you ask something more valuable than you really want. You wait for that person to refuse or essentially slam the door in your face, and then you ask the person for what you really want. So strong social influence can be taken with the approval motive, and this leads us to discuss conformity and obedience. So social psychologists in the 60s and 70s examined the influence of people in power and how normal, everyday people will conform and obey those around us and in power. And historically, they believe this was the basis for the atrocities that we see with the Holocaust. And so with conformity, it's a tendency to do what others do because others are acting in a certain way. So in the classic ASH study, a volunteer was in a group of their peers, and all of them were asked which line was longest. So the volunteer did not know, but the other group members were Confederates or those helping out with the study, and they were instructed to give both right and wrong answers. After a few trials, the volunteer began to go with the crowd and actually say the wrong answer. And they found that 37% of people followed suit and gave the wrong answer just like their peers. But the fact that we see not only just 37%, but just this phenomenon of this actual behavior of following and conforming to the group at all is an extremely powerful finding. So secondly, with obedience, this is the tendency to do what people in power tell us to do. So Stanley Milgram conducted an experiment of telling the volunteer to apply an electric shock to another participant when he got the answer wrong. So the one receiving the shock was a pre-recorded Confederate purposefully giving right and wrong answers and complaining about his heart trouble being affected by the shock. How far were participants willing to go to give the Confederate a shock? They found that 61% of the individuals obeyed the researcher and administered the final shock. And so these are just giving us glimpses into normal, everyday people and how we may conform and obey to those around us and those in power. And so the next motive that we talk about is the accuracy motive, and this is where people are motivated to believe what is right and to avoid what is wrong. So influencing our behavior are attitudes and beliefs, and attitudes are an enduring positive or negative evaluation of an object or event, and a belief is an enduring piece of knowledge about an object or an event. So attitudes are evaluations and beliefs are pieces of knowledge. And so this leads us to discussing informational influence. And it's different than normative influence where you act a certain way because you care about what others are thinking about you. With informational influence, it's often used in marketing. So if we think of any time we see a commercial telling us how a object or a purchase is reviewed. So a movie was given 2 thumbs up. The novel was a bestseller. The laugh tracks that we hear on TV shows are all ways of attempting to influence you based on other people's behavior. So similarly, persuasion is where an individual's attitudes or beliefs are influenced by another individual's reason. So systematic persuasion appeals to your logic and reason, and it wants us to use strong evidence for our thinking and our reasoning. So the information you intake when making a decision on who you want to vote for in the next election will hopefully be guided by reason and logic as opposed to heuristic persuasion, which appeals to your habits or emotions and wants to use heuristics or shortcuts to make decisions. So as humans, we're actually cognitive misers, where our brain likes to take these mental shortcuts. It really doesn't like to put its full energy into thinking in order to sustain that energy. So although this helps to maintain energy, it may allow for more mistakes. So for example, you may vote for someone based on the color of their skin as opposed to their platform and their stance on important issues that may affect your community. So here what we see with persuasion and consistency, one example of this is the foot in the door example. And this is a classic persuasion example. One study demonstrating the foot in the door technique asked to put drive carefully signs in people's yards. Only 17 of the people said that they asked said yes. However, when they asked people to sign a petition that urged the state legislature to promote safe driving, almost all of the people that they asked said yes. After signing the petition, the researchers then asked them to put a sign in their yard and found that 55% said yes. So why did we see this dramatic increase? Researchers point to cognitive dissonance, and cognitive dissonance is an unpleasant state that occurs when there is an inconsistency between our behavior, attitudes, and beliefs. So this may include of how you think of yourself in terms of seeing yourself as a very nice and thoughtful person, but treating someone mean and acting out in a brash kind of way towards that individual. Afterwards, due to this inconsistency, you may experience cognitive dissonance or an unpleasant state. And so because the people that signed the petition said that they believed or they had specific attitudes towards safe driving, in order to prevent this cognitive dissonance, they said that they would go ahead and put that sign in their yard. So here we have social cognition. And social cognition is what we do all the time. Whether we know it or not, our brain is constantly making inferences about other people's thoughts and feelings, beliefs and desires, abilities, aspirations, intentions, needs, and the character of that individual. And one of these, when we think of these social cognitions, it bases these inferences on two kinds of information. So the categories to which those people belong, or the groups that they belong to, and the things that that individual does and what they say. So one of these ways includes stereotyping. And so we usually hear it in a negative way, but there are positive and negative, or positive and neutral stereotypes as well. So even something as something as simple as offering a toy to a child is stereotyping, because you're implying that because it is a child, it enjoys toys. So ever since the word was actually coined by the journalist Walter Lippmann in 1936, it has had a distasteful connotation to it. And when we think of stereotyping, it's because why we use this, it's a useful process that what we see are oftentimes harmful outcomes, and it does so because stereotypes tend to have four properties. So stereotypes can be inaccurate. So we weren't born with stereotypes or beliefs, so how do we actually acquire them? There are only two ways to acquire a belief about anything, and this includes to see it for ourselves or to take somebody else's word for it. So most of what we know outside of a classroom may be hearsay, or oftentimes is hearsay. So stuff we pick up from friends, family, novels, TV, newspapers, magazines, jokes, movies, anything that we're exposed to. So this may explain why members of majority groups tend to overestimate the number of crimes, which are relatively rare events, committed by members of minority groups who are relatively rare people, thus why they're in the minority. Even when we directly observe people, we can end up with inaccurate beliefs about the groups to which they belong. And so stereotypes are also overused. And so you probably believe that men have greater upper body strength than women do, and this belief is right on average. But the upper body strength of individuals within each of these categories is so varied that you cannot easily predict how much weight a particular person can lift by simply knowing the gender of that individual. So in other words, just because one individual is male does not mean that they will have greater upper body strength. So we'll talk about these last two of self-perpetuating and automatic characteristics of stereotypes in the following slides. So a classic study conducted by Correll et al. In 2002 examined racial bias in volunteer participants' decision to shoot another individual. So the study uses automatic stereotyping where the individual had to make a quick decision in a split second, whether the person in the picture was holding a gun or a camera. And if they were holding a gun, then they had to shoot that individual. So participants did not have time to sit there and think about the situation. They had to make automatic decisions about the individual in the picture. And the individual in the picture was either white or an African American male. And so results of the study suggest that overall participants were able to accurately decide to shoot the individual if they were holding a gun. Further analysis found that participants were more likely to mistake a camera for a gun if it was held by an African American male. Interestingly, we might think that only the white participants made this mistake, but what they found is that both white and African American participants engaged in this error. And so when we think about stereotypes and just continuing this discussion of stereotypes, they're a bit like viruses, and once they take up residence inside of us, they perpetuate themselves and resist even our most concerned efforts to eradicate them. And so trying not to use stereotypes can make matters worse often instead of getting it to making it better. So trying hard not to do something can make us more inclined to do it. And we see this with perpetual confirmation or self-fulfilling prophecy or even subtyping. And so we'll talk about the first two concepts in the next slides in further detail. But when we talk about subtyping, this is a powerful method for preserving our stereotypes in the face of any contradictory evidence. So if we thought about stereotypes of nuns, for example, we may think of them as uptight, mean, and serious. But if we look at the photo in the slide, we see two nuns having fun and throwing snowballs at one another. So in this instance, we may say, well, these two nuns are the exception to the rule, or they're not like all the rest. And as a result, we've just used subtyping. Here we have an example of perpetual confirmation, in which a study had participants listen to the same basketball game, and some participants were told that they were listening to a game with a spotlight on either a white or African American basketball player. So after listening to the games, the participants rated the basketball player based on his performance. Overall, participants who believed they were listening to a game play-by-play of an African American basketball player rated him as having a better game and being more athletic, even though everyone in both conditions listened to the very same game. So this is an example when observers perceive what they actually expect to perceive. And similarly, we have an example of self-fulfilling prophecy. And so when people know that observers have a negative stereotype about them, they may experience this stereotype threat. So this fear can cause people to behave in precisely the way that the stereotype predicts. So this graph demonstrates a study where African Americans and white students were given the SAT, and half the students in each group were asked to list their race at the top of the exam. Students who were not asked to list their race performed well, but when students were asked to list their races, African American students became anxious and performed poorly. And so stereotypes can perpetuate themselves in part by causing the stereotyped individual or that minority individual to behave in ways that confirm that very stereotype that they were trying to come against. So we see the same thing across many different marginalized groups, not only ethnic minorities. So for example, we would actually see the same results when examining males versus females and assessing for math abilities. So shifting our discussion to talking about attribution. Attributions are inferences that we make of another person based on their behavior. So attributions are interesting to talk about because it's natural for us to make a judgment about someone's behavior. And there are two types of attributions, including situational and dispositional. And so if we were watching a baseball game and the batter hit a home run, if we made a situational attribution, we would say that he was lucky that the wind carried the ball into the stands, thereby applying it to the environment, as opposed to making a dispositional attribution and saying he's got a great eye and a powerful swing and making an internal statement about the batter himself. So here's where attributions get interesting. So we make errors in judgment by applying a correspondence bias or fundamental attribution error when we judge others' behaviors based on their disposition rather than the situation itself. So imagine you're a manager at your job and your employee comes in late to work for the third time this past week. You may make a judgment about them being lazy, immature, and irresponsible without really knowing the situation that they're going through. So this may include their car continually breaking down, no money to get it repaired, all the while they're having a sinus infection. So we're quick to make dispositional attributions as opposed to situational attributions unless it's about ourselves, and that is where we see the actor-observer effect. And when we make a mistake or act in a certain way, we make situational attributions and blame whatever is going on around us rather than it representing our own disposition. So when you're studying, remember that correspondence bias is making a judgment about someone else, and the actor-observer effect is making a judgment about ourselves. And so with that wraps up the second portion of the chapter on social psychology.